Let me introduce Terry Bollinger, who will introduce our speaker, Harvey Leake. Terry?
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Don, and thank you, the Entrada Institute, for the opportunity to come and talk to you. We are the Zane Grey West Society. We're a collection of individuals across the country and across the world who are researchers, collectors, enthusiasts, readers of the Western author Zane Grey. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about Grey, and he actually visited this area in 1929, and Harvey is going to spend some time talking about that. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Zane Grey and a little bit about our society. So, who was Zane Grey? He was a dentist who wanted to be a writer. So his formal education was he was a dentist, but he dabbled in writing, eventually got something published, and I shouldn't just say dabble, he became the world's best-selling author for many, many years. He was also an amateur baseball player. In fact, we have a vintage copy of a letter where he was offered a position, a job with the Boston Braves, who were the precursor to the Milwaukee Braves and then the Atlanta Braves. So he could have become a professional ball player, but fortunately for all of us, he became a writer instead. Wrote more than 9 million words in his lifetime, billed at death as the best-selling author of all time, sold over 40 million books in 23 languages, made this a big one, made an estimated $37 million from writing in his lifetime, said to be the first author to ever earn more than $1 million in 1 year. Traveled an estimated 2.5 million miles on the world's waterways and held 14 world fishing records. Later in life, his statement was that he wrote so that he could fish. He wrote so he could make enough money so he could take these big fishing trips. At least 2 popular TV westerns, 7 spin-off shows, a comic strip, hundreds of digest issues, comic books, all were based on or inspired by his work. For many, there were more than 110 movies made, and his name appeared above and larger than the film stars, and a lot of the film stars many film stars got their start in a Zane Grey Western. Randolph Scott being an example. There's others. John Wayne was in one. Gary Cooper. You can go through the list of stars, and many of them during those times actually were in Zane Grey movies. He also formed his own motion picture company, and believe it or not, there is a movie called White Death that he starred in. We have him talking in this. So it's a very strange movie, but we have it. One thing that you'd be interested in, he really espoused conservation, before conservation was cool. You'll find that as a theme in many of his books, conservation. Riders of the Purple Sage was his most famous novel. It was included in the Library of Congress list of the 100 books that shaped America. So just a brief introduction to Grey. A quick timeline. He was born in 1872 in Zanesville, Ohio. Zanesville was named after his ancestors, so he grew up in that area. Come on down, in 1896 he moved to New York City. 1903 he wrote a book, Betty Zane, and that was about his ancestors, a fictional book about his ancestors. 1905 he married Dolly Roth, moved to Pennsylvania, and then it becomes interesting. In 1906 he and Dolly honeymooned at the Grand Canyon, and then in 1907 and 1908 he took trips to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and those trips inspired him for many of his novels. A lot of his later novels were based on those trips to the north rim of the Grand Canyon. 1910, he wrote Heritage of the Desert. He also took an expedition to Navajo National Monument. So now he's picking up more material, and Riders of the Purple Sage was published in 1912, and it is set in that area around Navajo National Monument in northern Arizona and in areas in southern Utah. Rainbow Trail was a sequel to that, and it's based, a lot of that takes place around Rainbow Bridge, northern Arizona, southern Utah. In 1918, he moved to California. The first movies, the non-talking movies, silent movies were being premiered. Did a first hunting expedition on the Mungiong Plateau Plateau in near Payson, Arizona. Continue on down. He made 4 different expeditions to the Rainbow Bridge, and Harvey's going to, well, actually, one of those is going to be mentioned, but probably not tonight. 1929 is the one we're going to talk about tonight. This was his last grand southwestern expedition, and that's going to be a big deal. 1939, he died in California. Wanted to point out one thing. In 1912, he wrote Riders of the Purple Sage. He was born in 1872. He didn't really strike it big until he was 40 years old. That 1907 first trip to the West was with Charles J. Buffalo Jones. You might have heard of him. He started a buffalo ranch on the north rim of the Grand Canyon in the House Rock Valley. And he was trying to raise what he called cattlos, a mixture of buffalo and cattle. And Buffalo Jones was famous for trapping mountain lions, and he would make them available zoos back in the East. Well, Gray went along on these trips, and he was the photographer and also kept records of those trips. And that's where he got his first introduction really into the West. Many of the books that he wrote, Gray wrote Western romances, not just Western fiction. These were romances. And many of these in here, many of them were written set in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, in the Four Corners and the 4 states. Here's a listing of many of the other novels, but down here, Robbers Roost in 1932. And when he made his trip in 1929 through this area, he was collecting material, taking notes in order to write a novel on Robbers Roost. These books this map shows you where some of these books were set. Wildfires down along the San Juan River in southeastern Utah. Riders of the Purple Sage down in the same area. You can see all along here, Utah was a big state for Gray. He spent a lot of time here and he wrote a lot about Utah. And many of his most famous novels were based on locations he visited. And so you can see here's photos. Gray at Batatican, cliff dwellings at Navajo National Monument. Here's Rainbow Bridge, Monument Valley. Those 3 books were set in those areas. And if you're on Highway 160, driving like from Durango to Flagstaff, if you want to go through there, if you're just west, about 9 or 10 miles west of Kayenta, if you look to the north, you'll see this pass going up north from the highway. Gray called this Deception Pass. And when you go through there, you see a sign that says Segi, T-S-E-G-I. It's Segi Canyon, and that's Gray's Deception Pass and Riders of the Purple Sage. Silver screen, you can see, as I mentioned earlier, that many of the famous stars were starring in his movies. Comic strips, comic books. And this is us. If you want to find out more about us, we're at zgws.org. So that's a brief introduction to Zane Grey. And at this, let me make one more statement. Our purpose, our mission statement is to promote interest in and knowledge of the eminent American author Zane Grey and his works, to revive interest in the writings of Grey and preserve the sites of his writings so that future generations may realize the contributions made by Zane Grey toward the development of the adventure story in American literature. Would love to have you check us out. Okay, at this point, I'm going to introduce Harvey Leake, and he's going to talk about Zane Grey's 1929 trip into Utah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Zane Grey came through here, right through Torrey. In fact, he spent the night here, and he called it the finest one-day ride I ever had. At least that's how a journalist reported it. He said he was full of admiration for the wonderful scenery that he had seen. And there's nothing as beautiful anywhere else in the United States. So I think that says a lot about your area here. For Zane Grey, who had traveled widely throughout the West, and he really fell in love with this area. This is a photo of him coming through Capitol Gorge. At that time, that was a road if you were going from Hanksville to Fruita, you would go through Capitol Gorge, now a hiking trail, as you probably know. This is a map that it's old enough to show the old alignment of the highway, and you can see how the highway did go through that. It must have been a spectacular drive back in the day. This 1929 trip was really an epic adventure. He and I think 11 other people went about 3,000 or 4,000 miles, mostly by automobile, which was a change for him, but some sections of the trip they went by horseback. But unfortunately, we don't really have a detailed day-by-day journal of the trip. Sometimes we have diaries and so on, but not for the 1929 trip. So we do have these two documents, one called Fading Indian Trails that Zane Grey wrote. And he starts out by saying he's writing about the 1929 trip, but it's kind of philosophical and his view of the West and how that changed down through the years. So it doesn't really give a blow-by-blow account of this expedition. And then we also have some trip notes written by Zane Grey. He called it Robbers Roost country. And he does talk about the trip in detail, but a lot of it's descriptive wording. It almost looks like he was capturing his impressions of the colors and the shapes and the scenery to maybe use in his novel, Robbers Roost, that he was working on at the time. So there again, it doesn't say what he did every day. We've tried to piece this together as best we can, and we've gotten quite a bit of information. One source is newspaper articles. He was quite popular with the press, and so these are just an example of some of the newspaper clippings that talked about this particular trip. And that helps us pin down dates and where he was on certain days and where he was headed. But another source, this woman, Marjorie Thomas, was an artist that he brought along on this 1929 trip. And she put together this photograph album of beautiful, excellent photos from the entire trip. And they're not completely in chronological order, but we can use those and match them up with the actual places that we think they represent and get a good idea of where they went. There again, it's not comprehensive and it doesn't tell you the whole story, but it's a big benefit to us to have things like that. And what I'm going to do in my talk is show you a lot of her photos, because or the photos in this album. We're not absolutely sure she was a photographer. She might have been, but at least she put together this album and she owned the album. This photo is of the big entourage. And all the people that were with Zane Grey. That's Zane Grey there. That's his daughter, Betty. This is a guide from Flagstaff, Lee Doyle, and his Japanese cook is here, and his assistant, and some friends of his kids. His son Romer was also along. I think he probably took the picture. Here's Marjorie Thomas, the artist. And so quite a big group, and you can imagine the logistics of putting together an expedition like this, having the transportation, the food, the bedding, and all that, a major undertaking. They came out from California driving 2 Lincolns and 2 Fords. And then they were met up with Lee Doyle of Flagstaff. He had a couple of trucks and horses. So it was really a major undertaking, and I'm sure people noticed him when they came to town. This is a map of their route. I'll blow it up and show you a little more, but you can see the list of places they went, thousands of miles. But included, of course, is Torrey, Capitol Reef, and so on. They started out, Zane Grey was living in California at the time, Altadena, so they drove 700 miles from there and camped in Green River, Utah. I've divided this map into segments, so that's segment 1, segment 2, 3, and so on. And the portions that were by automobile, I have that symbol, or if they're by horse, I have the horse. So the first segment was down to Robbers Roost, the Biddlecombe Ranch, and that was very distinctly to gather information for this upcoming romance that was named Robbers Roost. They returned to Green River, and then they went over to the southeast through Moab, Monticello, Blanding, and down to Natural Bridges National Monument down here. And there again, we can piece this together through the articles, newspaper articles, and the photos. Back to Green River, and then that's when they came through this territory. There was a road going from Green River down to Hanksville at that time. And then they emphasized in the photos Blue Valley, which is west of Hanksville. Actually, it looks like they spent a little time there. Came through Capitol Gorge up to Torrey, and then, and this is all multi-day segments. Came up and over to Cove Fort, down to Zion, across over to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, over the bridge near Lee's Ferry, and down to Cameron. Then they went to the south rim, went over to Havasupai Canyon and took horses down in that canyon, came back to Cameron, and then they went up to Kayenta on the Navajo country. Now, just to let you know my connection with that, that was the home and trading post of my great-grandparents, John and Louisa Wetherill. And my great-grandfather, John Wetherill, was a guide, backcountry guide and outfitter. So he had taken Zane Grey to Rainbow Bridge on 3 other occasions, starting in 1913. They also ran a trading post and a guest house there, so it was a jumping off point and kind of the place to go if you wanted to see the Navajo country. From Kayenta, it was still a 70-mile horseback trip to Rainbow Natural Bridge over some incredibly rugged country. And on this trip, Zane Grey went this way and came back on a different route. And I'll talk a little more about that. This is just to give you the flavor of this long trip. Then they came back south and went to Flagstaff. And then, as Zane Grey was used to doing back in those days, they went to what he called the Tonto Rim. This is the high country above, north of Payson, Arizona, where he did a lot of hunting. And he actually had a cabin that he had built down below the Tonto Rim. So he was very familiar with that. He wanted to give his son and daughter a flavor of the adventures that he had had in the old days. So that was one of his objectives in doing all this. And hunting was part of it. And then back to Altadena. So quite a epic trip. So the second segment after they got to Green River was to go down to Robbers Roost. And This article said that he was hosted by Mrs. Millie Biddlecombe. She was the owner of a ranch down south of Robbers Roost, way out in the middle of nowhere. And we're very fortunate to know her granddaughter, Gay Marie Ecker. We're hoping she could be here, but she wasn't able to come. But it's fun to talk to her and learn about all these places that are pretty remote and kind of a different way of life. So anyway, this article identifies that Millie escorted the Zane Grey party down to her ranch. They drove down. There was a road. I imagine it was kind of crude and hard to travel, but they did it. This is another picture of the Biddlecombes. That's Millie holding her grandson and her two daughters, Hazel and Pearl. Hazel's husband is on the right of the picture. And this was taken at their ranch down in the Robbers Roost country. Pictures of it. The top picture is just a historical photo I found, but the bottom one is from this Marjorie Thomas album showing the Zane Grey party at the Biddlecombe Ranch, and I think they must have camped there a night or two. The Lincolns and one of Lee Doyle's trucks. At that ranch is a place called Crow Seep, which is pretty significant to those folks, their source of water. And then I think Millie probably loaned them some horses to go to Robbers Roost, which is to the north of the ranch. And here they are going through some of that rough country to see that. You probably all heard the story of Robbers Roost and this remote canyon where the outlaws would hang out back in the 1800s. And for quite some time, they were pretty well protected from the law enforcement because it was in such a hidden location that nobody could find them. In that canyon is what's called Robbers Roost Spring, and the water isn't very good there. It's alkali. But just to kind of digress a little bit, Millie Biddlecombe and her husband, Joe, visited my great-grandparents in Kayenta in 1926, and they kept a guest register and had their visitors sign in. So here's what Millie and Joe Biddlecombe wrote about Robbers Roost Springs. One drink of it, you lose your hope. 2, your religion is gone. 3, you want to rob a bank before another dawn. And then also in that area is this remains of a fireplace, which is attributed to a man named Cottrell. And his cabin got burned down, but it's still there. That's Zane Grey looking at the fireplace when they reached it on their little horseback excursion. And in the book, his novel, Robbers Roost, he mentions the fireplace. The photo on the right, we took that yesterday. It's still there. So it's fun to go back and recreate these scenes. So this is what the book looks like. Came out a few years later. And it was made into a movie as well. I think this is on the way to Natural Bridges, but it might have been on the way to Biddlecombe Ranch. They got stuck, and that's Zane Grey looking very frustrated there. So the trip was not an easy one, and you can imagine the roads back in those days were not very conducive to comfortable travel. Then they returned to Green River from Robbers Roost and went down to Natural Bridges National Monument. We have photos of that. They were able to drive down to the monument at that time, and then an outfitter, what we can piece together, let them use some horses to go down into the canyon. Now I want to talk mainly about getting from Green River to Torrey and beyond, because I think it's very interesting to see these scenes from this country that's not too far away from here. And you can see some of the obstacles they had. The river there was high, and they had to wait for it to go down. We don't know the chronological sequence of all these photos. One of these days, one of us will, or one of you can go out there and identify exactly where these are, and maybe we could have a real travelogue. But they're again held up by high water and creeping along. The map showed a road coming from Hanksville up to Torrey, but as you can see, it wasn't much of a road. Hauling a truck through the Dirty Devil. Zane, in this album, they called the Fremont River the Dirty Devil, and I think that was an older designation for it. But so keep that in mind. It's not necessarily the Dirty Devil that they're talking about. It's fun to blow these up and kind of look at what's going on and the dilemma they must have had at different times trying to get unstuck. Road washouts, they had to repair the roads. Making road. So it was on the map, but it had kind of disappeared, I guess. And then entering Blue Valley, which is that area between Hanksville and here. And they made a big deal of that. They actually, looks like, spent a few days there. And there again, you wonder what's going on. I'm thinking they came to a fork in the road and they were trying to figure out which branch to take. But a lot of things going on and a lot of interesting stuff. They slid off the road in this scene and had to get it back. It's interesting that this looks like Zane Grey right here, just pitching in to help him out. But despite all this, Zane Grey said how special this drive was. Blue Valley going through. Then it looks like they stayed for a day or two at this house somewhere. And in those notes of Zane Grey's, unfortunately, he doesn't discuss this, and he doesn't say whose house it was or how they had permission, if it was somebody he knew or they just found one that was available to camp out at. This particular photo, I noticed this rock up here, and I think it might be possible to drive down there and find that rock and then find the location of the house, and maybe we can determine whose house it was. So that's the kind of research we like to do. And it's pretty gratifying to put these pieces together. There's Zane Grey. Looks like he's riding. He might have been working on Robbers Roost at this same house. And here he is getting a haircut. His Japanese servant is doing that. So that makes me think they did stay there a few days. Another scene that might be recognizable to somebody. And here's one, looks a little muddy in that clay formation. leaving Blue Valley. And then here's the scene going through Capitol Gorge and Torrey. And I went there a couple years ago and found the exact spot where that photo was taken. As far as Torrey, unfortunately, the photo album doesn't have any photos from this area. All we have is Zane Grey's statement, the character of the country changed. And we went on into Torrey where we slept in a Mormon churchyard. There are a couple of rumors we've heard of houses that Zane Grey supposedly stayed in. This makes it sound like they camped in the churchyard. And this, as far as we know, is the only trip he ever made to Torrey. So those might just be urban legends about sleeping in those houses. But if anybody has any other information, we'd sure like to have it. From there on, Old Cove Fort, you might be familiar with, way west of here. And then on down to Zion, and then the north rim of the Grand Canyon. Havasupai Canyon, beautiful as always. These captions, by the way, are in the Marjorie Thomas photo album, probably put there by Marjorie Thomas. And then on up into the Navajo country, Navajo National Monument, Batatacan cliff dwelling. And then they came to my great-grandparents' home at Kayenta, and ready to embark on this horseback trip to Rainbow Natural Bridge. My great-grandparents, John and Louisa Wetherell, weren't there at the time. They had been subpoenaed by the federal government to testify in what was called the riverbed case, which was to determine whether the Colorado and San Juan rivers belonged to the United States government or the Utah state government. So they had the old timers come and testify as to whether they had observed navigation on those rivers in the old days, and that would determine who owned them. It turns out the United States government took ownership. But anyway, that's where the parents were. So their son, Ben Wetherell, my great uncle, guided the trip to Rainbow Bridge. This is a scene of a place called Organ Rock along the way, and the pack train going in there. It was obviously a very large pack train. And Rainbow Natural Bridge is beautiful as always. You can barely see the horses and riders there to know how huge that is. So Marjorie Thomas painted this painting of the pack horses under Rainbow Bridge, which she called Into the Rainbow Trail, and it's pretty special. Zane Grey, in the same guest register that the Biddlecombe's had written, and included these two pages, a listing of the members of the expedition and a little art piece by Marjorie Thomas. And then he wrote a little essay on one of the pages talking about his first trip to Kayenta and how things had changed, and actually how disappointed he was. The whole trip for him up to this point, I think other than Robbers Roost and Torrey and Capitol Reef, it was a big disappointment to him because the West had changed so much. You can imagine the north rim of the Grand Canyon when he'd gone there 1907, for 1906 and 7. It was complete wilderness, way far away from anybody else and any modern conveniences. Now there were tourists and roads and hotel and restaurant and all that. It wasn't the same, and he really had valued the frontier character of places that now were overrun with tourists. It seems like So that's kind of the upshot of this essay for Kayenta, even on the Navajo reservation in a remote area. He thought the Navajos had changed a lot, and people driving around in cars, which in the old days you needed to go by horseback. Then the final phase was up on the Mogollon Rim in Arizona, bear hunting, and he did get a bear. But there again, it was terribly disappointing to him because there were roads where there hadn't been roads. There were hunters all over the place. And it just wasn't the same. So, and he also had a falling out with the Arizona game officials. It was very disappointing. So he said, that's my last trip over this old trail. And he vowed not to come back to Arizona. So he didn't. I think the upshot of the thing is, it's interesting. I think people that write about nature probably face this same dilemma. If you publicize places and tell people about it, they're bound to come and want to see it for themselves, and then it won't be the same place that you were writing about. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think his disappointment with a lot of places was due to his own things that he had written and stirred up the public imagination and wanting to come out and see it again. So that's about the end of my story. I just thought you would like to see some of this connection with this area and the special place that it had in his mind when he came here. Thank you.
If anybody has questions, if you're here in live audience, you need to come to the microphone. Excuse me. If you're watching on Facebook Live, just go to the chat function, type in your question or comment, and Alan Dewey, our video guru for the night, will pass that on. Harvey and Terry, I have a question. The terrible fires in January in LA included Altadena, and I understand that Zane Grey's home was quite damaged. What's the status now? Do you know?
It's totaled. It's totally destroyed. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the Gray moved to California in the 1910s, and they built a home in Altadena. That home did burn in the Altadena fires. It's a total loss, and we don't know what the plans are right now for that. So, yes, it is gone.
And I think you might know also the cabin that he had up by Payson, Arizona, burned a number of years ago in the Dude Forest Fire.
Hello, great presentation. Was his initial purpose for the trip to go to Robbers Roost?
I think it was a dual purpose, to go there and also to introduce his son and daughter to some of the adventures that he had had when he was younger. But definitely to go to Robbers Roost was the primary thing. That's the first place he went. And he had the book in mind all along.
Okay, and then I grew up in Moab, and I understand that he spent quite a bit of time in Moab from time to time. I didn't know if you had any information maybe about that.
I think that's another one of those urban legends. As far as we know, this trip to Natural Bridges through Moab and then back was the only time that he was there.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Harvey and Terry, thanks so much. Welcome back.
Yeah.
I'm sure there'll be more things to talk about another time, too.
Okay,
Thanks so much.
we enjoy doing it. Thank you.
Just to